Hi, I'm Steve Hirschhorn, and welcome to the Gallery Teachers Masterclass. This one is it's about the language of youth. It's not only about the language of youth, but that's my starting point. And from there, I'm going to develop into other areas of specialized language. Amongst the ideas that I'd like to examine today is the idea of a set top-down syllabus versus a flexible or bottom-up negotiated syllabus, or, as we'll see, a combination of both as an efficient and rewarding way to work. So let's get going. Listen. Your new bike is cold. Oh my days, I literally saw a sick movie the other day. What do you think I'm talking about? Do I like it, or am I capping? These, and of course many more, are terms which are current amongst the English-speaking youth of today. But you know, it was always like that. It was ever thus. As a preteen in the 1950s, we had the verb dig, which was most fashionable. It went like this. You see a great car or some other attractive object and you comment, wow, dig that. To which your interlocutor would almost certainly respond, yeah, I dig it, man, or similar. In addition, do you dig could be used for requesting confirmation that one's interlocutor understood this or that. Do you dig? My parents didn't use this verb other than in a gardening context. I'm doing some gardening. I'm going to dig the garden. It was an identifier of the group to which I and my co-agists belonged or aspired. Actually, I heard this term used on a recent US TV show, so I suppose it's kind of stuck with us. But I'd say not so much in the UK, perhaps. I also read it a few days ago on a Facebook guitar enthusiast site. My guess is that the writer was about my age and hadn't dropped this usage. I have to say I haven't used it for 60 years, probably. Following on from dig, we had fab, which meant more or less the same thing, though its grammar was different. It was a really fab gig. Yeah, it was a gas. So fab was an adjective, while gas was a noun. You can't say it was a gas show. Here's a quick translation. A nice concert. It was great. It was a gas. Every generation has their special terms or somewhat unique structural contortions. Going a little bit deeper, think about this. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like completely cold. I know, right? I was like, that's so lit. But she was just like salty because she's like, it's just cheugy. Now, this might sound a bit strange coming out of the mouth of somebody of my age, but I haven't got a teenager around who can help. This little exchange may well be beyond your comprehension. It was certainly beyond mine before I checked with my grandkids what it all means. And to be fair, I've crammed it with examples, making it really quite inauthentic, and thereby hangs a tale. It's a matter of authenticity. Authenticity rules. Language should occur naturally. Don't overload. You shouldn't be piling up examples in order to practice something. I'm talking not specifically now about youth language, but about anything that we're teaching. I've seen teachers loading up sentences, and in a moment I'm going to show you an example of exactly that. We should allow discourse to develop and produce examples authentically. Working on, for example, the present perfect doesn't mean, well, shouldn't mean, we create language which is crammed full of that structure just so that learners have exposure to it. Have a look at this. So I've been to the supermarket, then I've been to the shoe shop, then I've walked to the bus stop, and the bus has arrived, and I've got on and I've gone home. This is designed, presumably, to practice form, but practicing form without context and creating inauthentic examples is entirely counterproductive. It has no purpose. Now, you may think this example is ridiculous, but actually it came from a teacher that I was watching. I wrote it down word for word. So let's just go back quickly and have a look at the examples from before. And I'm like, what do you mean? It's like completely cold. Any ideas about this? Any thoughts about what? Perhaps you have come across this language and know exactly what's going on. So a little light analysis might be helpful here. And same with this one. I know, right? I was like, that's so lit, but she was just like salty because she's like, it's just cheugy. So have a look. Let's have a look at some of that specific usage. And I'm like, what do you mean? Which means, of course, and I said, what do you mean? It's like completely cold means apparently it's very nice or very attractive. I suppose that's taken over from cool. Cold being colder than cool, or maybe they're even concurrent. I don't know. So we have the verb like used to signify say. I'm like, hello, which may or may not be in the agreeing tense or aspect. But we also have it as a filler with no discernible meaning. It's like brilliant. When my grandkids use this latter, I ask, well, was it like a great day or was it actually a great day? They know I'm joking, or at least I think they do. Let's move along. I know, right? Doesn't mean anything, but it's a social lubricant. And I must say that this particular construction is used outside of youth speak. I've heard it from much, much older people. I've heard it from middle-aged people. I've seen it written actually from people almost my age on social media. So it doesn't mean anything, but it's a powerful strategy. It's inviting agreement, isn't it? You know, right? And then we have that's so lit. What's that? Well, it's equivalent to my fab in the early 60s. If something is lit, it's super good. That's lit. But she was like salty. This one's a strange one, isn't it, really? Apparently it means angry. Who knew? She was like salty. And lastly, it's just cheugy. Cheugy. I had to check how to pronounce that because it doesn't immediately spring to mind, does it? That it's cheugy. It could be something else. Anyway, it means out of date. Something like an anachronism, perhaps a bit like me. Anyway, apparently I did a little bit of research on this word, and apparently it was coined in 2013, so it's not brand new, but it went out of fashion. And this rather indicates, or rather is an example of what I was talking about right at the beginning, that youth speak changes. In this case, something emerged in 2013, went out of fashion, and now apparently is coming back into fashion, at least in the US. I don't know if this is used in the UK. I haven't found an example of it in the UK, but certainly in the US. So as well as these lexicalisms with their own forms around them, we should also pay attention to other matters. For example, upspeak. This is a suprasegmental pattern which causes almost every single utterance to rise at the end. it's mostly a youth phenomenon, but I've heard people in their 20s and 30s using it. I'm pretty sure that those who do upspeak are unaware that they're doing it, or at least how it sounds to the listener, or to this listener at least. To my mind, it suggests uncertainty and doubt, which I often feel is a shame, since the person speaking could and should be confident and proud of their comments and views. Every utterance sounds like a question form. You know what I'm talking about? They say it comes from Australasia, and that way it may well be the case, but it's certainly ubiquitous in many other parts of the world now. You'll get into trouble if you do that. I know, but it's worth the risk. Don't say I didn't warn you. Again, this does sound a little inauthentic, partly because I'm not used to doing that, and partly because I've crowded the examples together. And yet I've heard such examples, and I'm always waiting for the exception to the rule. That is, if one of the interlocutors produces something which uses an intonation pattern which I actually expect. Now, given that we work on intonation patterns in our classes, we do, don't we? Specifically for examples of question forms. Questions with a yes/no answer tend to rise at the end, don't they? Not always, but you know, in general. Do you like rice? Rising intonation. Whereas other questions tend to fall. What's your name? Falling intonation. Of course, it is possible to have what's your name with a rising intonation when you've misheard, or you think you've misheard, or you're asking for confirmation. What's your name? What did you say your name was? It's possible. But I'm talking about general usage. So we can argue, and I think I will argue, that for learners, hearing this upspeak pattern could be extremely confusing, especially at a low level. They're expecting a closed question, which can be answered with yes or no, and there is no word order suggesting a question. Could that be confusing to people? I think it could. Okay, so look, that's a short intro to what's going on. It's a microcosm in the world of youth language, rather specifically in the UK, I think, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that those terms and forms are known and used elsewhere in the English-speaking world too. In any case, youth everywhere has its own idiom. And my question is quite simple. As a language teacher, should you be paying attention to it, or should you just ignore it? Should you, or indeed could you, teach some of those items to your learners, or is it just not worth the time and effort? The question assumes one or two things. First, that you're teaching an age group in which the argot would, in any case, be appropriate or relevant. And secondly, that your students are likely to be functioning in a context where such colloquialisms would be expected, understood, and reciprocated. I'm talking about appropriateness of language, really. So let's look at this from another angle. Presumably, if you're teaching dentists, you'll fashion a syllable which responds to their dentistry needs. That's not just technical language. In fact, in my own experience, dentists and other medical practitioners know their own technical language, but more often than not, they need work on pronunciation of those terms, since English pronunciation of Latin is different to, for example, German pronunciation of Latin. But they also need, or may need, academic reading and writing skills, so they can read papers, perhaps that they can write papers. They may need public speaking coaching, and perhaps surprisingly, they might need the language of networking when they go to conferences and want to talk to their colleagues from all over the world. Likewise, pilots will know their own terms, but they will certainly need help with pronunciation and understanding a variety of accents from around the world. Getting the stress difference between 13 and 30 could cost many lives. We're at 13,000 feet. We're at 30,000 feet. We're at 13,000 feet. We're at 30. 13, 30. Such a misunderstanding could be deadly, could be disastrous, couldn't it? So we're not really talking about the specifics of these professions, but we're talking about language which is around the central idea of those professional needs. We're talking about ESP, English for specific purposes. There's English for almost everything these days. There's aeronautics, there's chemists, there's police, there's officers, police officers, bankers, naval personnel, doctors, rocking horse painters, well, perhaps not the last one, bankers, university lecturers. But we have ESP courses for almost every profession and trade. Whether they're actually necessary or whether they're in fact just another money spinning device is the topic for another time. Now, from that perspective, could it not be that given any group of students who are in some ways similar to an ESP group, in as much as they have specific needs to later perform in specific contexts? In the current scenario we're examining, the group focus is age-related. And one could argue that teachers should be offering exposure to and practice with using team language. Teens, we are agreed, I think, have their own terms and their own grammar, and sometimes can communicate together, showing their membership of the group, meanwhile excluding old folk like me. I'm not, by the way, talking about dialectic varieties such as African American vernacular English or the varieties found in the Appalachians or the Highlands of Scotland. So since these are not specific to age, but are mainly, though not exclusively, geographically sourced, I'm talking about standard language which has been temporarily transformed or adjusted within a certain age bracket to then be dropped as speakers get older and be again transformed by the new arrivals into that age bracket. So assuming the conditions above are met, teachers should be offering alternative terms to their learners. They should be exposing them to that language and making the essential point about appropriateness to a given context. Going for a job interview, for example, requires checking one's appearance to make sure one looks businesslike. It requires finding out something about the company or potential workplace, and it requires having a small number of important questions ready to ask. In addition, language appropriate to that scenario should be available and used. Yo, dude, how's it hanging? May not be the best way to greet your new potential employer in a formal interview. Therefore, language in context must be considered. The context includes the physical space, the interlocutors, and the topic area. So we find that teen learners must develop parallel modes of address and of general communication. Good morning is ubiquitous greeting, but I've never heard two under 18s using it to greet each other. All right, or hi, how you doing? Would be more appropriate, wouldn't you agree? So it's not all about specific incomprehensible jargon, but also about standard language being used in specific contexts. After all, how you doing is quite accessible, isn't it? On the other hand, what's up or what's up, as it's often delivered, confuses me as a greeting, since in my world, what's up means what's wrong. You see somebody looking sad, for example, and you might say, hey, what's up? But the youth version simply means hello. And they tell me that no particular answer is required. I did ask. But the question might arise as to how one is to access this constantly changing language. And that, I think, is a valid question. Perhaps I can suggest a few ways. Obvious amongst them is to contact friends who have teens in the target language country and ask for a hand. That's what I did when I was researching for this workshop. Next would be Google. Other search engines are also available. I also did that. Typing English youth speak or similar. Also possible would be to set a task for your learners themselves to research, assuming they have internet access. So this is rather some practical advice, if you like, dividing them into groups so that the whole class doesn't have the same question. Give each group a secret paper with the task written. For example, find out how British, US, wherever you're working, youth is expressing something, something really fun, for example, something really unpleasant for group 2. Group 3 could be greetings. Group 4 could be something else entirely. Something extremely boring, for example, might be quite interesting, and so on. When they've completed the task, perhaps for homework, and they're back in class, give them time to discuss within their groups what they found, and perhaps even to construct some dialogues containing their examples, and then have other class members try to guess what their terms mean. So this becomes kind of a game, really, and a bit of fun, as well as something potentially very useful. I think this kind of responsive and collaborative teaching learning helps to motivate students. Well, I don't think, I actually know it does, since they feel what they're doing is relevant and they justifiably feel valued. Have I made the case? I hope so. But now I want to try and do the opposite so that we get some kind of a discussion going on. I'm not an expert in medical English, nor am I a pilot, neither financial nor aeronautical. And so how can I efficiently teach the language of these professions? I suppose I can buy a book, but that might lead me through the areas I should know. But what if there are questions? So students ask questions, and I'm not an expert in these matters. So what am I supposed to do? As a non-expert, I could lose the confidence of my students since I don't know the language they're dealing with. How old are you? Are you a teen? You might be. I have a granddaughter who's was a teenager when she qualified as a language teacher. So you might be a teen, but if you're not, how do you know what teens are using? How should you know the slang which teens currently use? Note, currently. Can you research the language of youth, which might not even be your own L1? Perhaps you can do what I did and contact some friends, as I've mentioned before, who will provide you with examples of what you want. But have you got such contacts? If you have, great. If not, so that's the first problem, already touched on actually. The access to authentic language relating to the group we're discussing. And then it's not difficult to argue that teachers are teaching teens to speak the language of their peers, the slang of their peers, if you like, does little to advance their prospects of passing exams or impressing adults. Of course, they probably don't want to impress adults. I know I didn't at that age. So we're talking about a niche area which could arguably be seen as detrimental to the quality of language we're bound to impart. After all, it is expected that we will teach what might be described as proper language, I suppose. Isn't that right? Teaching what in effect is slang is contrary to what we're charged with, teaching the generalizations of a language rather than the specific genre of the over 70s or under 20s. Unless, of course, we're teaching a group who've paid for or asked for something more precise in terms of their own end game, as it were. We don't teach medical terms to general English classes beyond the inexpert headache, stomachache, backache, etc., because those are terms which everybody needs. We're not required to engage with anything more technical. Our students probably don't want nor need the Latin for ankle, for example, nor do they need to know the precise terms a pilot will use on approach to a rainy runway at 11 p.m. But perhaps commonly used terms on a flight might be useful. Overhead lockers, fasten seatbelts, will be landing in, that special use of the future continuous. All those things are useful for general English classes. But what about taboo words? Do you teach them? I'm talking about swear, or commonly known as swear words. Do you teach them? I'm not going to call trouble on myself by iterating those words, but I use them in my general speech, and they're common enough in films and media these days, certainly in the UK, perhaps in the US slightly less so. But the Brits freely allow quite the strongest of these collections to appear on the radio and certainly on the TV. So why not teach them? Learners will hear them, see them as graffiti or on social media. We want to know what they mean and how to use them. They may even see things like this, a ruse which always amuses me, since to understand those part words, one has to say them to oneself, so eliminating the need for such delicacy. And with this device, I've returned to the pro-teaching argument. There are things, words, terms, forms, expressions, which are commonly in use amongst various groups in society, be they professional groups or social groups, age-related groups. And it's part of our job, I think, to select that which is actually relevant to the groups we teach. Relevant means likely to be useful on a receptive or productive level. You could argue that with a class of priests, for example, one wouldn't need to teach the production of taboo words. But on the other hand, those priests might well be working in areas with people where such language is commonplace, and therefore to at least recognize what is being said, even if never produced, could be very useful. How do we manage that dichotomy? We might have a group with teens and older people. Is teen language appropriate to those older students? How do we manage that dichotomy? Perhaps we have a group of diverse professionals, a couple of nurses, an architect, a cab driver or two, and so on. They don't all need the same language. How do we manage that dichotomy? You can send in your answers on a postcard. The answer, of course, is actually very simple and straightforward. It's deceptively straightforward. We ask them. Beyond the general English of general English, we ask them. Bit of an anticlimax, that, sorry. We move happily towards a negotiated syllabus in which learners are able to have a say in what is taught alongside the essential, probably book-led syllabus. Now, some might think that's rather idealistic. They might comment that they couldn't do this with their state school teen groups who barely make it to class on time, if at all. Let me suggest that negotiating at least part of the learning plan with your students, whoever they are, helps to motivate, helps to give them a sense of ownership, of belonging to the process. As a result, learning will be enhanced, teaching will be easier, groups will collaborate more, and in general, everyone will be happy. Of course, I'm painting rather a rosy picture here, but the substance of what I'm saying is, I think, true. All too often in schools around the world, students are subjected to a top-down syllabus wherein they have no connection, and consequently they lose enthusiasm for the language classes, assuming they ever had any enthusiasm at all. So what I'm proposing is not just for teens, actually. I'm proposing that learners be engaged with their subject matter by being able to have a voice in its selection. Even young learners can be given some responsibility, some sense of a choice over their syllabus. They can be asked what they like to talk about. Given that we still don't have that playground-based corpus and the kind of things that they say to each other, we can ask them, what kinds of things do you talk about? This can be done in an amusing way through a few minutes of role play, for example, rather than asking necessarily direct questions. And then, of course, there's always the chance to listen to them in playtime. Some of this research, which what it is really is research, will have to be done perhaps in the first language, in L1. But that's okay. We're past the stages of beginning, of banning L1 in the classroom, aren't we? We can agree that L1 has a place in the monolingual classes where the group comprises multiple L1s. And then there's a debate to be had on whether the use of L1 can be seen as non-inclusive, but where L1 can be used for a valid purpose, then young learners and more mature learners alike can benefit from having been considered, being respected, and being involved in the process of planning their own learning. So in practical terms, I'm making the case for allotting at least some time to language learning which is relevant to you and relevant to the individuals you have in front of you. Whether or not you're personally and professionally equipped to manage such language is moot. It's moot because part of your job is to make sure that your level of language is appropriate to your students' expectations. Would you agree with that? It follows then that your knowledge of the genre of language your students will need must also be adequate. And if it's not, then you have to make it so. I recall many years ago having a private student who was a maxillofacial surgeon. I had no knowledge of this field at all and told him so. As I've already mentioned, many professionals know their own lexis. There's, of course, no pre-formed syllabus for someone who is that kind of a surgeon, at least there wasn't in those days. So he knew his own lexis, but he also wanted to be able to narrate videoed surgical procedures at conferences. He showed procedures using cadavers at these conferences. And so in order to be able to provide the service he wanted from me, I too had to view these somewhat gory practices, sitting alongside him while he explained what was happening, and I provided the correct version. Much of this was much of the use of the passive, of course, was evident. So I'm talking about getting students involved, and you doing whatever it is to make sure that you know what they need and be able to give them what they need. Because the top-down syllabus really has no connection with students. There's nothing going on which can necessarily connect with them. We have to therefore find other ways which will, I'm almost prepared to guarantee it, will help everybody. It'll help students, it'll help you, and it'll help whoever is in charge of those students, whether they're parents or company executives or whatever. So I'm arguing for a mix and match approach. I'm not saying dismiss the top-down syllabus completely. I'm saying let's engage students with content. Let's find out what they want. Even small children can do that. I can't remember how many times I've tried to stop teachers from having very small children talking about the weather because they don't. They just don't. And yet it seems to be in every every young learner's course book. It's a lovely day today. Yes, the sun's shining. Well, the kids don't say that. Using L1 if necessary, if they're of such a level that you can't really use L2 to have these discussions, fine, use L1. And look into whatever it is they want. Make sure you are up to it, is my message. So yeah, so that's it really. So I hope that this has been useful. Was it lit? Was it ping? We haven't looked at that term. I'm going to leave it there. You can find out if you're interested. Was it fire? Or was it cheugy? Do you think I've been capping? We haven't looked at capping either, so I'm going to leave that with you as well, and you can go and you can go and find out if you like. I hope you liked it. I hope it's gassed you up, as it were. Thanks for being here. And don't forget these fantastic, useful resources on the Gallery Teachers websites. You can go and have a look at previous masterclasses by all kinds of wonderful people and lots of other interesting things going on.